Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to your Cybersecurity Series. My name is Vlad, and I'm here to help you and support you in your cybersecurity journey, even if perhaps you don't have a technical background. Today it's episode 29, and we are continuing our series on cryptography. So far, we really focused on encryption. I gave you different examples, different illustrations, and we talked about symmetric versus asymmetric encryption. We know that they are using different sets of keys, but in the end, the principle is the same. It's all about preserving the confidentiality of our correspondence, meaning making sure that only the intended recipient is able to read our message. But having said that, we are leaving out or setting aside other properties in cybersecurity. For example, the integrity of the message, meaning making sure that during transit from the sender to the recipient, the message has not been changed. We are also leaving out an essential property, which is about authenticating the sender. So far, we know that the recipient, only him or her, can read the message, but we don't really have a proof that the sender is who they claim to be. And the idea to answer all of those questions and make sure that all those cybersecurity properties are respected is to use what we call hash functions. So hash functions, that's the menu of the day. And then I will also give you some insights on how hashes are pragmatically being used in information systems today. And it's really about passwords, or should I say password storage. So we will talk about those passwords and what does it mean to salt a password, depicted here with a 3-star Michelin restaurant. So, speaking of the menu of the day, we will start with the hash functions and then we will move on into passwords, password storage, and salted passwords. So, hash functions, these are algorithms or mathematical functions that take as an input any digital document. So, it can be a plain text document, it can be an image, a video, sound, web pages, anything you want can be hashed. And the result of this hash function is what we call a hash or a digest. And it is basically a plain text file, a plain text series of characters, and the length is predetermined. So, for example, you get 40 characters of text. Those characters, most of the time, they are expressed in hexadecimal because it's easier to read, but the idea is that the size is always the same. Those hash functions, they have properties, obviously. First of all, it is a deterministic function, meaning that any file, the same input will always produce the same output. If you hash the same file twice, you will get twice the same hash as a result. And that's absolutely fundamental. We will use that during the integrity check to make sure that our message has not been modified. But more on that in my future videos. Second of all, the hash functions, they have to be easy to compute, meaning that a hash must be produced quickly with the least amount of resource possible. If you focus on the black arrow here on the graph, you will see that it's really going from left to right. Basically, it's also to illustrate that hash functions, they only work one way. It's impossible when you are given the output, when you have the hash, it is impossible for you to have any type of information on the input. You don't know what was the format, you don't know how complex was the document, you have no idea what was the input. So it's really one way. Once you have hashed the document, you are left with what we call its digital signature. So the hash is also what we call the signature. It's basically this tiny element which corresponds to a really sets of characters, really tiny sets of characters. Number four, property, it's basically meant to be collision resistant. So the idea is that if a hash is what we call a signature, it should only correspond to a single file. It should be extremely hard, if not impossible, to find two documents that are different but that result in the same signature. Of course, and that's why I'm writing impossible in italic with a small asterisk. From a mathematical perspective, it is possible because as an entry, as an input, we have an unlimited number of files. There is any file that you can imagine, any element that you can imagine can be hashed. So we have an unlimited amount of documents that in the end are only expressed with a certain number of digits or a certain number of characters. So of course there has to be two, three, or even more documents that end up with the same signatures. But from a cybersecurity perspective, it's not really about the possibility, the mathematical probability. It's really about the ability of an attacker for a given signature, for a given hash, to find a collision. So it's not really answering the same problem. And um, this is what we call the robustness of the hash function. So it's really about making it hard for the attackers. We know it's theoretically possible, but we are testing them, and that's about the computing power and the patience that the attacker has in order to find a collision. Finally, fifth property, it has to be change resistant, meaning that if you change anything within the input, like even a single character, even a space, even a comma, it's not only a single character that will change in the hash will change entirely. And to illustrate that, I have this example. So here you have the input. We are using text because it's easier to visualize. So in the blue boxes, you have always the input. So for example, the word fox. We have in yellow the cryptographic hash function. So here we are using what we call SHA-1. That's one example. And you get as a result the digest. So the digest is here, for example, this set of 40, um, 40 characters. So 40 characters expressed in hexadecimal. And as you can see, regardless of the length of the input, you always get 40 characters in output. So it's not sometimes 20, 25, and up to 40 characters. No, it's really always 40 characters in output. And if you look closely at the examples number 3, 4, and 5, what you can see is that we have changed slightly, we have misspelled one of the words. So the sentence should be, the red fox jumps over the blue dog, but only changing one character means that the digest has changed completely. And if you look only at the digest, there is no way for you to know if we have used as an input a sentence, an entire document, a book, a picture. Also, you are only left with 40 characters, which do not give you any more information. Speaking of functions, if you have been working in IT, you might have come across some of them. There is, for example, MD5, which is extremely widespread. It's very fast to compute, so sometimes it's being used. However, this function is today very much deprecated. It should not be used anymore because it's extremely vulnerable to collisions. So we know that it's not very hard today with MD5 to find a second document that would have the same signature, which is why MD5 has been deprecated and is more or less being abandoned today. Then there is the SHA family, so SHA-1, SHA-256, SHA-512, and so on and so forth. SHA-1 is deprecated. It's the one I used as an example. And the others, so the 256 corresponds to the size of the hash it produces. So 256 bits, which correspond to 64 characters in hexadecimal value. So those are considered secure for the time being, at least in 2025, because the size of the hash is big enough. So it gives enough possibilities or enough probabilities, meaning that it's still hard today with modern computation techniques to find some collisions, as long as, again, your hash is of 256 bits length. Similarly, you have Blake 2B, Blake 3, Ripe MD, Whirlpool. There are others. You might have heard about NTLM, which is also deprecated. It's also vulnerable, but it is the legacy hash functions implemented within the Windows operating system. Today, of course, they advise to replace that with other authentication methods. For example, Kerberos, which we've talked about in the previous video, but that's just an example. This list is by far not exhaustive. It's really just to show you some examples. Before we jump into the next slide, just want to illustrate that the principle behind that is that hashes are equal to the digital signature of pretty much any document. And if you keep that in mind, we will build on that in the next video. However, today, I also want to give you a pragmatic example of how hashes are being used. And one of them is the storage of passwords. As you know, passwords, they should never be stored in plain text. That's basically obvious. You should not have passwords on post-it notes, notepad file, Excel file, anything that is not encrypted. So sometimes what you find is that websites or companies, they store not passwords but hashes of the password. And the idea is that when a person tries to log in, the system is going to compute the hash of what the user submits and compare with the hash of the password. If they both match, you are free to get into the system. So the idea is really not to store the password itself. We only store the hash value, which is one way to make sure that we have the right input. Again, it really assumes that the hash function is robust, meaning that if I submit a different input, a different password, there is no collision, meaning that my hash will be different, and the system is not going to match both hashes together. I will be not allowed into the system. Why do I say that? It's because there is this famous website within cybersecurity, which is called Have I Been Pwned, which basically compiles all the leaks, I mean, not all, but most of the leaks that we see in the industry. Today, they have a huge database of almost 900 leaks that occurred worldwide. It's not only France or US, it's really worldwide. And they have identified 14 billions of accounts that were breached. So when you type in your email address, it tells you whether or not your email address was part of a leak. And if so, it highlights some recommendations. Perhaps you would have to change your password, perhaps, or at least it will make you aware of certain elements that were leaked on your account, so any type of account information. If you go on the website, for example, you can browse some of the breaches. For example, here we have Disk Union, the first one as of today, June 9, 2025. So there is always a small box saying, okay, what happened? So they tell you that Disk Union is a Japanese record chain store company that was breached, and the incident exposed approximately 500,000 of unique email addresses, but also names, postcodes, phone numbers, and what we do not want to see, plain text passwords. And on the right side, it also gives you some breach information, like when did the breach really occur and when was it added to Have I Been Pwned. So in this case, we are talking about a breach from June 2022, but still to show you that today, in certain breaches, we do find plain text passwords. It's not only about passwords. I'm also taking a recent example from Free. Free is a French internet service provider. It was really hot in the news a few weeks ago because essentially 14 million accounts leaked. And this time it was not really about passwords, it was about bank account numbers, dates of birth, genders, names, physical addresses as well, which is all a package of information that can be used by scammers to get some money out of you. But back onto the passwords, the idea is that sometimes if the passwords that are leaked are in plain text, well, it's game over. Your account could be taken over by a hacker. But sometimes what leaks is not really the password, it's the hash of the password. As I told you, the hash is what is being used, by the system to authenticate you. Meaning that in the end, you would have a list of hashes, for example, SHA-1 hashes that would be leaked. But the thing is that it happens so often that the hackers, what they do is that they compile those leaks together and they create what we call rainbow tables. So though this has nothing to do with the Pride Month, it's really the name that we give it to them. So rainbow tables. It's basically a pre-computed lookup table of hashes for many passwords, so millions of passwords. Meaning that if the hash of your password is in the leak, sometimes they know already what was the password that corresponds to. So they are kind of breaking the hash function. We said that the hash is a one-way function. From the input, you get a hash, and you should not be able, from the hash, to get the input. But they are trying to break a bit this principle by maintaining list of known passwords. So here I'm showing you an example with a top 6 of the passwords that are being used. So for example, 123.123.456. This is a password that unfortunately is still being extremely used today. So this hash for SHA-1, for MD5, for all the other cryptographic functions is already known. Same for the word password. You would be surprised, but the word password is often used as the password. QWERTY, admin, I love you, welcome. Those are all very dummy examples of passwords, but the hashes are known. So if you are using them and if the hashes are leaked, the hackers, they will find out your password. That's the essential element. So that's the concept of rainbow tables. However, from a defense perspective, there is still something that we can do about it. It's basically what we call salting the password. So now you should be able to understand my first reference getting into this course. So the idea is that we are going to use a salt. It's a random string, so random sets of characters that we are going to add to the password before hashing. So we have the plaintext password here in blue. So we have two users, Alice and Bob, my favorite couple in cryptography. So we have the same passwords, for example, 123212345 6, and we are going to add a salt. So for example, XY7 exclamation point. And then we compute the hash. And you can see that even if the password of two users is identical, the hash is going to be extremely different. Having said that, you need to understand that those rainbow tables that I told you about, they are based on simple passwords that were not salted. If you salt the password, and if the salt, of course, changes and is unique for every user, for every password, you generate a new salt, they would have to use a different rainbow table per user. So the effort becomes extremely high, meaning that in the end, it's not really worth maintaining tables and tables and tables, because you would have to recompute millions of hashes for millions of possibilities. So that's extremely hard and costly in terms of computing power. So instead, the hackers have to resort to brute forcing. So it's something that is much more costly for them, because it really monopolizes IT equipments, and it's really a defense technique that is slowing them down. So this concept of salting passwords should always be implemented when you have to store certain credentials, and of course never store them in plaintext. You take the plaintext password, you salt it, you compute the hash, and then you only store the hash. I mean, you store the hash and of course the salt, because you need sometimes to recompute the hash to authenticate someone. In terms of brute forcing speeds, this is a report coming from Hive Systems. They update it almost every year. So here they have taken as a hardware 12 NVIDIA graphic cards, so NTX 5090. So it's quite a heavy setup, 12 of them. They are giving you an example of how much time do you need to break a certain password. Of course, here they are not using MD5 hashes. They are using also a modern function, for example, bcrypt. But basically, it shows you that 10 characters, depending on the complexity, it might either be instantly broken if you are using only numbers, or it could last a certain number of years if you are mixing lowercase, uppercase, different sets of letters, which is also why we have in those passwords policies, sometimes, you need to use one lowercase or at least one uppercase character, or you need to mix some elements, because it's really about slowing the attackers down. It's not impossible, but at least they cannot reuse their rainbow tables. So a big part of their preparation is out of the window, and that's what we want from a defense perspective. All right, this is all for today about hash functions. In the next episode, I will show you more about how we are using those concepts about digital signature. How do we mix that back with encryption to make sure that we can maintain all the nice cybersecurity properties? I hope you enjoyed. See you soon in the next video. Take care.